You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have some breaking news right now as far as Donald Trump's effort to prosecute one of his biggest political enemies is concerned. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Brian, 3 strikes and you're out. A grand jury, again, just refused to indict Letitia James for these trumped-up charges of bank fraud. You know, the grand jurors are sitting as the conscience of the community, and they are proving to be one hell of a bulwark against the Trump administration, against Pam Bondi and Lindsay Halligan and company's prosecutorial overreach, their prosecutorial abuse, and flat-out prosecutorial misconduct. So this is the third time the Trump administration, the Bondi Department of Justice, has failed spectacularly in trying to prosecute one of Donald Trump's announced enemies, avowed enemies, Letitia James, the current New York State Attorney General. So, you know, the one thing that this really highlights, Brian, is there have been 3 attempts to indict Letitia James. The last 2 attempts were by somebody who is actually a federal prosecutor, albeit a guy from way out in Missouri, because they couldn't find any legitimate, experienced federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia U.S. Attorney's Office, where the case is being run out of, who would have anything to do with this, what appears to be a vindictive prosecution by Trump and Bondi and Halligan. They went all the way out to Missouri. They brought this guy in, Roger Keller. He went into the grand jury once, and the grand jurors said, oh, hell no, we are not indicting Letitia James on the evidence you just presented us. He went into the grand jury a second time, and we just learned that the grand jurors again said, oh, hell no. They returned a no bill, reportedly. They refused to indict Letitia James. So it really begs the question, what in the world did completely unqualified hack, unlawfully appointed U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan do in that first grand jury? What did she tell them? What evidence did she present them when an actual federal prosecutor now twice couldn't persuade grand jurors that there was probable cause to indict Letitia James? Now, I am hoping this will put a nail in the coffin of this vindictive prosecution, this repeated attempt to bring what are clearly baseless charges against Letitia James. But, you know, let's be clear, there is no maximum number of times that a prosecutor can present a case to the grand jury, but it becomes almost overwhelming evidence of vindictiveness if they just do it over and over and over again with the same result.
You know, you said something that caught my attention, which is this idea of what did Lindsay Halligan say to try and secure that prosecution, notwithstanding the fact that Lindsay Halligan herself was improperly appointed, and so her prosecution is null and void. But is there any way to find out, will this be an ongoing investigation? And kind of building on that, does that imperil her law license moving forward?
Oh, it absolutely does. And it's a great question. Will we ever know what Lindsay Halligan did in the first Letitia James grand jury? Well, interestingly, we already know a good bit about what Lindsay Halligan did in the first James Comey grand jury, where she did secure an indictment, and it was promptly dismissed by a federal judge because she was unlawfully appointed to the position. She literally did not have the lawful authority to set one damn foot in the grand jury, never mind get an indictment of James Comey. But courtesy of litigation in the Comey case, the judge got a hold of all of the grand jury transcripts and the audio recordings of what Lindsay Halligan said and did in the grand jury. And what the judge in her findings revealed was Lindsay Halligan ran roughshod over the rights of James Comey. She talked about a rule of law that was contrary to the constitutional guarantee of the right to remain silent, the right against self-incrimination. She led the grand jurors astray with respect to James Comey's constitutional rights. We also learned that she likely presented evidence that was incompetent before the grand jury because it enjoyed an attorney-client privilege. So we know that she absolutely acted improperly, and it looks like unethically, in the James Comey grand jury. Now, we haven't had comparable litigation in the Lindsay Halligan grand jury because her first indictment was dismissed by the judge for the same reason the judge dismissed the Comey indictment, because she was unlawfully appointed as interim U.S. attorney, and she didn't have the lawful authority to go in and get that indictment. But Brian, you've heard me say I'm not a betting man. I am not a high roller. $1 is my betting limit. I'll put the full buck on Lindsay Halligan having acted just as inappropriately and unethically in the Letitia James grand jury as she did in the James Comey grand jury. And now to finish answering your question, will we ever find out? There are two ways we might find out. One, if they actually go back before a fourth grand jury and manage to somehow finagle an indictment out of that grand jury, it's becoming less and less likely. But if they do, well, guess what? We are right back in the same posture where that issue will have to be litigated, and you can bet the judge will order, I want to see everything that Lindsay Halligan did in the grand jury the first time and compare it to what another prosecutor did the second time and the third time and the fourth time. But there's even another way we might see what Lindsay Halligan did in the first Letitia James grand jury. Let's assume that DOJ finally gives up the ghost and they say we're not going to be so embarrassed by going into a fourth grand jury and getting another no bill, and they just end the prosecution or the pursuit of a prosecution against Letitia James. Boy, if I'm Letitia James, I am probably going to bring suit for a civil rights violation for the way she was vindictively and unlawfully pursued. And as part of that litigation, guess what she should get in discovery? All of the grand jury audio recordings from all of the grand jury presentations by both Lindsay Halligan and by Roger Keller. So there are two potential ways that that information will see the light of day.
Glenn, isn't it also true that with every subsequent attempt at prosecution, in the event that one of these actually does stick, that the fact that there were so many prosecutions is just further evidence against the Trump administration and for the defense in saying that we are the victims of a vindictive prosecution? Look how many times they tried to prosecute this person. So in effect, every time they try and prosecute Letitia James, they're just making it less likely that they'll be able to successfully prosecute Letitia James.
They're creating valuable evidence that Letitia James can use to prove she's being vindictively pursued. And, I said a few minutes ago, there is no limit. There's no statute and there's no constitutional principle that says, for example, a prosecutor can only present a case 3 times or 4 times. It is all up to the discretion of the approval authority. And I would think the approval authority in a case like this is probably the Deputy Attorney General in consultation with the Attorney General herself. When I was a federal prosecutor, we would have to go up to the U.S. Attorney if we ever wanted to represent a case to the grand jury, which in my decades of experience almost never happened. We didn't present bullshit, baseless, evidence-free cases. We presented only cases where we believed we could easily prove to the grand jury's satisfaction probable cause, and we believed we had enough admissible evidence to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt once we took that indictment and went to trial. So now let me go back to the notion that there's absolutely no limit. There is this thing in the Constitution called the Due Process Clause, and courts can look at a prosecutor's, unhinged, vindictive determination to bring baseless charges that multiple grand juries have said are not supported by the evidence against somebody just because the President of the United States doesn't like that person. And at some point, I suspect courts will say it is a due process violation to continue to hound, Letitia James by going into grand jury after grand jury after grand jury, holding this over her head, continuing to spew it out into the public square. Look, we're investigating these horrific crimes we allege Letitia James committed. At some point, that begins to look like a due process violation. So although there is no set number, for multiple reasons, the more times they try to go into the grand jury and get this indictment and fail, the worse it gets for the Department of Justice on many fronts.
And finally, let's finish off with this. Donald Trump alleges that Letitia James committed some form of mortgage fraud. But now, according to a new report from ProPublica, it looks like Donald Trump committed the same, or is alleged to have committed the same mortgage fraud that he framed against these people. Donald Trump signed a mortgage in 1993 for a home in Palm Beach, Florida, claiming the property would be his principal residence. Then 7 weeks later, he got another mortgage for a different home and claimed the same exact thing. And so can I just have your reaction to the fact that on top of the fact that he's installing these improperly appointed prosecutors that have no jurisdiction to prosecute these cases, on top of the fact that he is engaged in nothing more than vindictive or selective prosecutions, that at the far end of this thing, he himself is alleged to have committed the same exact crime that he's trying to pin on his opponents.
Brian, and interestingly, he may have actually committed a crime that Letitia James didn't commit, based on the public reporting of the loan that she took out. But setting that aside, yeah, I'm sure, Pam Bondi's Department of Justice is all over an investigation into Donald Trump's alleged mortgage fraud, right? Yeah.
Right.
Here's the thing, couple of things. First of all, people will say, yeah, but presidential immunity? No, because he did that in his private capacity before he was president, so he wouldn't enjoy presidential immunity. But really, more importantly, that's probably well beyond the statute of limitations, given that he did it back in the early 90s. However, it doesn't mean it wouldn't be valuable evidence to prove the point that this is a vindictive prosecution by a president who has engaged in the very same conduct he is now alleging, Letitia James should be prosecuted for. It would probably be a minor point that Letitia James could make in her motion to dismiss for vindictive prosecution, in the unlikely event, getting less likely every day, that she will actually be indicted and taken to trial. But it still may be relevant evidence that she can use and exploit in a motions hearing.
Well, look, I think more surprising than the fact that Donald Trump is accused of committing the exact crime that he's trying to pin on other people is the fact that the sun is rising in the morning. So, look, obviously, more to come as it relates to Letitia James, whether the Trump administration is going to try and go for yet another attempt at this thing, another bite at the apple. But for those who are following along, if you want to stay on top of legal news, please make sure to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work, best way to support independent media, and it is and always will be 100% free. So if you're not yet subscribed, please click the links on this screen and hit the subscribe button. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.